Now, this video might be more for listing agents than for sellers, but maybe not, maybe for both. This is about having confidence in your list price. A lot of people get an offer and they run to a counter offer right away and things like that, or maybe a listing agent's losing confidence in their list price because they haven't seen the right action yet. My message to sellers and listing agents is don't lose confidence in your list price. List prices need to be protected, defended, and believed that you're going to get that list price. So home sellers, you're not getting enough offers, you're not getting enough showings. This is a personal decision whether you're ready to sell or not. A lot of listing agents will pressure a seller into dropping their price, but I think it's the other way around. You as a seller have to determine what you want. If you're ready to move and you're ready to, start that packing process and go under contract, the ball's in your court. You can always drop your price, but just make sure you drop it enough to get a full price offer. Something a lot of sellers don't think about is where are you going to go once you go under contract? When I'm representing a seller, I represent sellers with single agency, meaning I have a fiduciary duty to protect them and help them. I always want to know, where are you going to go when you go under contract? It's very important. The reason why it's important to know where you're going to go before you list your home in the MLS or go under contract is because sometimes it's not easy to move out. Packing is difficult, it's stressful, so make sure you know exactly where you're going to go, that you have even a backup plan for that. And that is really important to me as a listing agent. Next. So we're talking about open permits. The FAR/BAR regular contract, October 21 version of the FAR/BAR contract. It's not the as-is. They call it the regular contract or the repair limit contract because there's something in this contract that provides 1.5% of the contract amount in 3 categories. One of those categories is for open permits. So if you leave the number at 1.5%, and you're selling a $500,000 home, we're talking about $7,500 that the buyer can use to close out open permits against the seller. So that's the topic here. So when you're dealing with open permits, it's a question is, what kind of contract are you working on? And title insurance professionals care about that because they're responsible to closing that transaction per the contract. So they care about what the contract says and what kind of contract they're working with regard to open permits. So we're talking about open permits, and now we're going to talk about it from a title insurance perspective. Title insurance professionals do not care about open permits. They can close a transaction with an open permit. The lender might care, but likely not. And how do I know that? Because we've done a lot of real estate transactions. I'm also a title licensee with New Frontier Title. We just closed a very difficult transaction with many open permits. So what are the costs to sell a home today? So first of all, you have commissions. You have commissions to the listing agent and to the buyer's agent, which you negotiate with your listing agent, and you put that into the listing agreement. The other costs are documentary stamps on deed and owner's title policy. Documentary stamps on deed are typically paid for by seller, and they're 70 cents a hundred. So if you're selling a house for $500,000, it'd be $3,500 to the state. As far as title insurance, seller pays title in all counties in Florida except Miami-Dade, Broward, Collier, and Sarasota. Title insurance is promulgated by the state of Florida. Call your title insurance company and they will give you a quote. Basically, title insurance is about $500 per $100,000 of value. Now let's shift to the contracts. So what kind of contracts are there in the state of Florida? Well, we have 5 contracts in the state of Florida. We have a contract for Tallahassee, Jacksonville, and for Naples. Those are what's called board contracts. The board of realtors and their attorneys created their own contract based upon the as-is Florida contract. Now, there's also 2 other state-approved contracts. One is the FAR/BAR as-is contract, and then the regular contract. The next nuance of an as-is FAR/BAR Florida contract is a lot of sellers believe that it's as-is where-is, which means once you go under contract, you get to buy that property and I'm not negotiating with you. That is not true. The as-is FAR/BAR contract is as-is with right to inspect and right to cancel, which means if the buyer doesn't like anything about that house, I don't care if it's paint color, change their mind, the dog doesn't like their dog house, they can get out of that contract by simply canceling it by their inspection period, which is their first contingency. Another important element of the Florida FAR/BAR as-is contract is the time to accept deadline. This seems like a very important date to most buyer's agents, listing agents, and sellers. It basically says you have until 5 p.m. tomorrow or the next day to counter or accept this offer or it's withdrawn. For me, it's sort of a puffery kind of date because buyers aren't going to walk away from their offer. And also, if you counter any part of their offer is really terminated. So it's a kind of a nuanced thing about an offer process. Some people take it more seriously than others. For me, it's more like offer puffery. So what is the best contract to take when you're selling a home? Well, as I said before in a prior video, the Tallahassee, Naples, and Jacksonville board contracts are very similar to the as-is FAR/BAR contract. For me, I like the FAR/BAR as-is contract. It's very clean, very simple, and I think anybody that even a mom and pop for sale by owner seller would understand the FAR/BAR as-is contract, unlike the regular Florida contract, which I'll talk about next. The reason why the regular contract, as opposed to the as-is contract, is not my favorite contract is because the repair limits of 1.5%, or you can negotiate them. You can cross the 1.5% out and put $500, which a lot of people do. A lot of sellers do that, of course, because it limits their liability to the buyer during the inspection period. But that 1.5% default number means that 1.5% times 3, or 4.5%, is reserved to be argued with structural, open permits, and other things that might be wrong with the home. That's something that I would not agree with ever as a listing agent. No way. FAR/BAR as-is contract is preferred. Another important consideration of a contract is the close date. So before you write in that close date into the contract, make sure you know exactly where you're going. Because one thing I do know, once you make terms with a buyer and you sign a contract, you literally aren't going to be able to change a thing. They're not going to allow you to move the closing date back. They're not going to allow you to change anything to the contract. So make sure you are comfortable with that close date and don't expect the buyer to change one single term once signed. Another consideration on the Florida as-is FAR/BAR contract is escrow deposits. So, of course, you have to write in the escrow holder on page 1 of the contract. You can't leave that blank. But as well, how many escrow deposits should you get? Well, the way I negotiate a deal and how I've trained my staff and my agents is that I want 2 escrow deposits. I want an initial deposit and a second escrow deposit after inspections for approximately 3.5% of the sales price. So why is escrow important? The reason why escrow is important to the seller and for the buyer is its equitable consideration for the transaction. But most importantly to the seller is that it's your only recourse that's practical for liquidated damages. So if the buyer were to default, you need to have enough escrow in place where you're covered for your damages. Because if you lose a buyer and it takes 30 days for that buyer to exit the deal, that could cost you anywhere between $3,000 upwards of $10,000. So escrow is very important consideration in taking a deal. So a lot of people ask this question all the time. How do I breach out a buyer? Well, you have a couple breaches that a buyer could be breached out upon. One would be escrow. They fail to put in escrow timely. You could breach them out on the very next morning or at 12:01 in the morning, send an email saying that this contract is canceled for failure to provide escrow. That's one way. Another way to breach out the contract would breach out the buyer in a as-is contract, for example, is the loan approval period, which I'll get into next. So one breach that the buyer could do to lose the deal, or for a seller or a listing agent to breach out a buyer, would be for the buyer to fail to give notice to the listing agent or the seller of loan approval. Typically, the default loan approval timeline is 30 days. I like 20 days. So if they don't provide that notice that they've got underwriting approval, which is loan approval, on day number 21, I could literally breach them out by saying to them they failed to provide notice to me or the seller of their loan approval, so they're breached. Another popular question for home sellers is, how many home inspectors can a home buyer bring in during the inspection period? Well, they can bring in any amount they want. There's nothing in the contract or any of these contracts that says who can come, who shouldn't come. As far as I'm concerned, a seller should allow any home inspector into the property. That would be roof, septic, building inspector, structural. But I don't agree with allowing architects and designers and people that are measuring for the remodel into the home until all the inspections are done, and only at the convenience of the seller. Here's a home inspection that a lot of people aren't so aware of, and it's radon gas. Radon gas is naturally occurring everywhere in the country, and it can be absolutely, positively harmful to your health. It's the #1 reason for lung cancer, right behind smoking cigarettes. So a radon test is easy to perform. It costs about $350 to $400. As a seller, do you want somebody to perform a radon test in your house? Probably not, because they're probably going to find radon. And if they do, the remedy is about $2,500 to $3,500. And what they do is they drill holes under the slab and they vent out the slab to the outside with a vacuum system, like a venting system. So as a home buyer, I would certainly request that my agent performed a radon gas inspection. It is very important. Radon's in everybody's homes. The only question is, what is the level? Are they high enough to be harmful to humans? If they are, you need to get it remediated. And the rate to remediate it is, you vent the slab, which could cost anywhere between $2,000 and $4,000 to vent a slab for radon gas. So a common question I get from home sellers and buyers is escrow. Who gets it if somebody defaults? Well, you have to read the contract. There's many conditions where the buyer might get their deposit back if they cancel within the inspection period, or they give notice that they cannot get the loan commitment on time. They are protecting their escrow. The only time a seller gets escrow is if all the contingencies of the sale have passed, meaning inspection period and loan approval, and you're in that space between that date and the close date. If the buyer defaults then typically on its face, escrow would go back to the seller, but it has to be agreed to by both parties, and a release and cancellation must be signed. I get this question all the time. I lost my buyer. Can I go back in the MLS without having my release and cancellation signed by the buyer? Well, the answer is you can, but the problem is I would not go under contract with the next buyer until that's executed, because then you might be obligated to sell the home to two people, and you know that's impossible. The last thing to talk about in this short series about how to sell your home for full value is, how do you pick a listing agent to sell your home? Well, of course, you can look at the reviews online, and you might get referred to an agent, but you might even ask them a question like this. So when you're interviewing an agent, ask them how they do figure out what your home is worth. And what I'm driving at is what's called proving value. Proving value is a way to look at value, not through the eyes of the listing agent or the seller, but through the eyes of the buyer. More about proving the value of your home. How do you know you've got all the money for your home? How do you know that when you sell the home for $580,000, that is full value? The only way to really know, and the way I negotiate, is to make sure that you get more than one offer. And the way you do that is, don't add wiggle room to your listing. Price your home exactly where you think it's going to sell, and let those buyers speak. And when they speak, they're going to make offers. And once they make a bunch of offers, then your listing agent will have a chance to drive those offers up from where they presented them, and then eventually prove the value of your home. But that can't be done if you only have one offer. It's rather difficult. Thank you for listening to me talk incessantly about real estate for probably 30 minutes. If you're listening this far, either you think I'm an expert or maybe you're sleeping. But assuming you're awake and you want to hire an expert realtor, negotiator that knows a lot about real estate, consider hiring me. My name is Keith Robert Gordon. I'm the broker and co-founder for Altru. Thank you.